All right, episode 11. Tyler, welcome on the podcast, man.
Thanks for having me. It's awesome to connect with you a few months back, and I get so much joy from finding young podcasters that have a lot of energy, and you're no exception. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Like Tyler, you're like one of the most like curious people I've ever met, like in my life. And you have your own podcast, you have conversations with many amazing people. Um, and something that really struck me, and we can talk about this to start off the conversation, is your fitness streak. You're
Hmm.
approaching 900, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm like 2 or 3 days away from 900.
Wow, man, congrats. Yeah. So what gave you the inspiration to start that fitness streak, and how did that change your life? Because I imagine, putting in the reps for 900 days straight it's bound to create some ripple effects across different
Hmm.
areas of your life.
Yeah. So the origins of the gym streak were basically about 2.5 years ago. I had first started becoming more public with what I was sharing online. But there's always that bit of friction and like fear of social judgment that you have when you're kind of putting yourself out there, especially in the early days. And I very much felt that. And so I was trying to think of ways in which I could reduce that friction to any extent. Right. And I had already been a huge exercise and gym advocate. And because I was so into fitness, I was like, I might as well try and test myself and create sort of an accountability challenge and see how many days in a row I could work out and post some evidence of that onto my Instagram account and just see like where it goes. And the origins and the motivation was very much so I wanted to reinvent myself both from a I guess, creative standpoint, but also just getting in the practice of putting stuff out there every single day. And so I was already like going to the gym almost every single day for many, many years before that. But this has been an awesome way for me to just like map my progress out over time. And in terms of some of the unforeseen benefits from the gym streak, like there are people that maybe a few years back I had come in touch with briefly, and they were really into exercise and fitness and calisthenics and all of that stuff. But for one reason or another, we just, whether it was geographical or just where we were at in life, didn't have that many opportunities to reconnect. And me even just like posting every day on Instagram has been a way for me to keep in touch with people. And so that was a little bit unexpected. But the origins were ultimately me like wanting to force myself to put myself out there on a regular basis. And it's pretty humbling, especially early on when you're in the gym and you're working out and you kind of like set up a camera and a tripod and all of that stuff. It feels very awkward, especially if there's other people in the room. But in terms of breaking those psychological barriers, it has, I think, helped me in a lot of other avenues aside from, just sharing online.
Yeah, that's great. I think public accountability is such a big lesson here. It's like sometimes when we want to develop a skill, sometimes the best way is just to put yourself out there so people
Mm.
can like know, okay, you have to keep your streak, so you got to keep going. Yeah, and also like what you touched on is like how you've been able to meet different people around the world because of you putting yourself out there.
Mm.
And you touched briefly that you started, posting more frequently online, several years ago. And how did that really change the game for you?
So, in terms of even thinking about career development and where I wanted to be investing like my time and energy and resources, I had worked for an investment bank early in my career. And I had thought that I wanted to be some sort of an investment professional and manage money in the long run. And what I had realized was like when I looked at the guys 5, 10, 20 years out, they didn't have the type of life that I hoped to live. And so I felt like I was on the wrong path. And so when I ultimately decided to leave the whole finance industry, what I realized was I was investing all of my energy and resources into assets that ultimately were not my own. So, when I was slaving away like 90 plus hours per week, that's an
Wow.
exaggeration.
Yeah.
But, into PowerPoints, into Excels, into all of these things. And as soon as I left the firm, it's not like I had access to any of those things. I couldn't call those things my own. And even the relationships that I built within that ecosystem, they were very much tied to that ecosystem. And outside of that ecosystem, I lost a lot of those relationships and connections that I had invested in. And so the lesson for me there was like, I need to be doing something independently as well, even if it's on the side. And so building like a small newsletter, even starting my own podcast, all of that stuff, like those are relationships that I'm building and I have direct access to those channels. And regardless of what happens to me from a corporate or company perspective, even if I were to get fired or decided to switch jobs or any of that stuff, I'd have control over that. And so I had always been a curious person for, even before I started sharing online, but I hadn't really expressed that into the open, into the public on social media. And it was really the reflections of where am I investing my time, energy, and resources? And am I playing the long game that ultimately, compelled me to start doing more stuff online, kind of like you are now.
Yeah, I think I came across your tweet, which you wrote, if I could go back to school, I would be much more strategic about meeting like-minded people. And
Mm.
would you like recommend like, sharing your stuff online as one way to like meet these high quality friendships?
100%. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and I think that is a key piece of the equation because
Um,
it's crazy for me. I was doing a marketing and advertising learning sprint. Basically, this was maybe a year ago, maybe a little bit less than that. But
yeah.
basically, I compiled like 10 to 15 books on marketing and advertising because I just felt like I didn't really understand that subject matter, but that if I did understand some key principles within marketing and advertising, that would serve me well in the long run with all the projects that I'm working on. And there was a specific book, and I'm blanking on the name. It's not Claude Hopkins, but it's one of his colleagues. And the long story short is he was telling his own basically story, it was his autobiography. And it was crazy for me to see the hardships that he had to endure in terms of becoming successful, and to think that he literally had nobody around him that was supporting him, that was rooting for him. He had no, social backdrop. And the thing that's really unique with the internet that I found is that if you can find even 2 or 3 people to bounce ideas off of, to collaborate with, that are supporting your work, that are just providing you words of encouragement, like that stuff goes a long way. And I didn't realize that when I first started. And I didn't really have that many people that I would be in regular communications with about things that got me excited. But as soon as I started doing the podcast and finding a few friends that gave me a lot of energy, in terms of that translating to just overall such an improvement in quality of life. It's like the internet is so cool in that it can connect you to those people because they might not be in your immediate geographic vicinity. And so I've got friends now, in India, in the UK, in South Korea, all over the world. And we can have conversations every so often. And that has been such a fulfilling part of this whole endeavor.
Yeah, I think it was Sean Furry who said, we want to build a magnet when we're posting stuff on the internet because we're kind of attracting like-minded people that we can
Mm.
like share ideas off of. And I want to touch on learning sprints. I think that's such a cool concept. So could you briefly describe like what it's about and kind of how you came across that?
It's a very simple idea, which is that basically, if there is a concept or some sort of domain where I feel like I just don't understand it very well,
Mhm.
then I will try and compile 10 to 15 books on that subject. And I'll take recommendations from people in my network. I will take recommendations from people that I respect, specifically in terms of like their literature and their reading consumption.
Mhm.
And I'll just work through those 10 to 15 books on that specific subject. And one of the reasons why I personally find reading to be a valuable asset in my life is because sometimes when you just sit down with an idea and you think long enough about it, then it starts to sear into your brain in ways where it just couldn't if you only spent a few hours on that idea or on that concept. And so what I'm trying to do with the learning sprint is if there are deep ideas or principles within that domain, getting that explained to me with as many different stories by as many different people, just in as many different frames as possible. And I have found that to just be very kind of mind opening in terms of my
Mhm.
understanding. And as one example, the first learning sprint that I had done was on kind of banking and the monetary system. And I was putting these books together, and part of me was like, hey, I know a lot of this stuff because I studied economics at Stanford, and
Yeah.
I've listened to tons and tons of podcasts, on this type of content. But at the end of the learning sprint, I had realized like, wow, there was so much depth in here that I had only touched the surface of. And the conclusion of that like 10 to 15 book long learning sprint was, holy crap, I still don't know or have a deep enough understanding of this subject matter. And there's so much more that I need to, uncover. And so it was a very humbling experience as well. But it's funny because there's so many people that just don't read in general. Like if you even read a book a year, you are in, the top decile in terms of readers globally, which is unfortunate. But the other dimension to that is if you're willing to pick up a handful of books on a specific domain or topic, you
Mhm.
can very quickly see when people are kind of bullshitting you versus when people actually know their stuff. Because even if you aren't able to articulate in full like the deep concepts behind some of these domains, you can be like, okay, I've read a handful of these books, and what this guy is saying kind of checks out with a lot of that stuff, and he's actually adding on to that knowledge. And just to be able to identify that has been, I think, pretty powerful. And I'm only
Mhm.
at like 3 or 4 learning sprints at this point, but I hope that
Yeah.
this is something I can continue to do for the rest of my life.
Yeah, man. How long does each learning sprint like take? So I imagine like reading like I don't know like 10, 15 books on it. It'll definitely take like a substantial amount of time.
Yeah, it definitely varies
Yeah.
because the learning sprints have not always been the same in terms of the amount of books. And also, when
Mm.
I undertook those learning sprints, I was at different points in my life. And so, when
Uh,
work was really busy, then inevitably I had to, not have as much free time to engage in those learning sprints. But overall, they would take like 3 to 4 months. And I'm hoping over the next year, potentially 2 years, while I have basically some free time to be in South Korea and explore and work on some passion projects, that I can complete at least like 3 or 4 learning sprints is my goal.
well, that sounds really exciting. Yeah, I think what you touched on briefly about like reading books is that a lot of like the content you see nowadays that are like pumped out every single day, a lot of them are downstream of the ideas presented in these books. So once
Mm.
you read the books, like everything will flow downstream and you'll have the foundation to kind of understand more deeply about like the content that's being produced today. Would you
Yeah,
kind of agree with
that's
that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny to see just like waves on social media. Like 4 or 5 years ago, I had started to see the René Girard wave coming
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
And then you can see how that like seeps through into the populace, into the consciousness of everyone. Is like even if people haven't read Girard now, a lot of people are able to reference them or they know of him. And so you see that with other concepts as well, which is really funny. But it's cool to try and get on the ground floor of some of those ideas and actually read the foundational works, because I think that it goes a long way.
Yeah, I discovered Gerard like a few years ago, and I remember it wasn't as mainstream as it is today. I feel like it's like referenced in like so many different places. It's like, wow, this is not like a previous few years.
100%. Yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah,
funny. I think I had
yeah.
read Luke Burgess's book Wanting
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
probably like 2.5, 3 years ago, and that kind of put me onto Gerard. But I actually haven't read any of like Gerard's works himself,
Yeah.
and so that's another like learning sprint example that I hope that I have the capacity to undertake in the next couple of years as well.
Yeah, I have one of his books, and it's like an incredibly dense read. So I'm like, oh,
I
do I
think
want to
that's why
embark
it's been
that?
tempting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm curious, how have his ideas on like mimetic theory like kind of influenced your life? Because for me at least, it definitely made a really big impact on how I see the world and how I approach like how I want to live my life. So how did that influence your life?
I think it just made me, it gave me a framework to point out basically when I was succumbing to social pressures and I didn't even realize it. So, like, by nature, I'm a very competitive person. Like, if you just put me in an arena and say, here's the objective, go play the game, like, I can get lost in the game. I mean, in
Yeah,
high school, my thing was StarCraft 2. And so I would spend like hours and hours grinding StarCraft 2. And some of my friends were like, "Hey, we should play casual, fun mini games within the ecosystem." And I was like, "No, I'm here to win. I'm here to play. I want to take this seriously, right?" And that is my mindset with a lot of things that I engage in. Is I want to be successful and I want to compete. And I think the danger is that if you're not competing in arena that is like long-term beneficial to your success and you're only playing zero-sum games, then you are going to live a life that is much more miserable than somebody who can see the type of game that they're playing and is actively trying to play positive sum games. And so throughout my like college career and even during my time in finance, I hadn't seen that I was just a competitor in this larger ecosystem that was trying to fight to get to the top, right? And it wasn't until I had read some of Girard's works and thought a little bit more deeply about the competitive atmosphere that I was in that those things started to become more clear to me, and also allowed me to say like, hey, I need to pull myself out of this ecosystem because I don't think it's the right one for me. And then the other thing I think is just the social inertia that exists. Like if you are in a group of people over time, those people's desires, their viewpoints, their worldview, it'll just rub off on you unless you're very careful about and cautious about how they're framing questions, about the types of things that they're listening to, the types of content that they're digesting on a daily basis. And so the whole like thinking for yourself is a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think even today, I still struggle with that a little bit. I worry that I am just adopting the viewpoints of people that I respect that are in my ecosystem. And that scares me a little bit. But just in terms of being more thoughtful about my life, I think that the whole Peter Thiel, Girard, all that stuff has influenced me to some extent.
Yeah. I think you had an essay that said like play your own game. I thought that was a really really good read, and people should check that out.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's tough, because I think the hard thing about playing your own game is you have to try and define like what your own game is, and
Yeah.
especially when you're young in life, it's like you have no idea what the heck you're doing. You're just kind of
Yeah.
a fish in this broader sea, and you don't have even to know. I think it was Abraham Maslow who had said like even to know what you truly desire is a deep psychological feat, because most people think that they know what they want, but when they get that thing, they realize, oh no, this isn't what I wanted after all. And so to be able to define like what game you should play is just like a very difficult thing to do.
How can someone cultivate a greater sense of self-awareness in terms of that, like, you know, that type of game of knowing what games they should be playing?
Man,
Yeah.
cultivating a sense of self-awareness. I mean, I wonder what your perspective is on this as well, but
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the things that I often worry about is like if I were to look down 10, 20 years from now and I were to have kids, like how would I get them to become self-aware, and to what extent is self-awareness really like a genetic component, and to what extent can that actually be like taught in people? I think it's very, very hard. Like Warren Buffett and Charlie
Yeah.
talk about the circle of competence dynamic, right? And it's the people who understand their own circle of competence that do well in this world. And even if you're not that intelligent, if you know the fact that you're not intelligent, then you will go farther than the person who is intelligent but doesn't realize the limits of his intelligence, right? And so it oftentimes, I ask myself this question of, to what extent can that humility be taught, where people can actually look at themselves and say, here are the true limits of my knowledge and understanding. And I don't have a great answer for how that can be taught, because in all dimensions of my life, whether it is from a career perspective or it's from personal friends and family, I don't see any rhyme or reason to those people being taught self-awareness. But in terms of like how one should navigate their life and what signals they should be picking up on, I think the thing that has become more top of mind for me recently is trying to push yourself in the direction of what is it that's giving you energy and what is it that's draining energy from you, right? Because the framework that, and I come from a finance asset allocation background. So the way that I have oftentimes looked at life was like, there are these various assets in life, these asset classes, you can call them, right? You've got time, how much of it do you have? You've got relationships, how much of it do you have? And you've got money, and how much of that do you have, right? And the whole thing is like, if you can win the money game, if you can win the time game, if you can win the relationship game, then you are set for life, right? But I think the one thing that misses out on is this component of hope. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of hope because there are people that, by all three of those metrics, in terms of money, relationships, and time, they have an abundance of those things, but they don't have like this energy or this zest for life. And I wonder why that's missing. And I think that oftentimes it comes down to the fact that those people don't have great hope for their own future. There's nothing for them to be looking forward to. And when you don't have any sort of optimism about the future, it's just a very hard life to live, regardless of how materially comfortable you are.
Mhm.
And so I think that one thing that I've been trying to do is to move in the direction where I'm interacting with people that give me more hope and energy and excitement for the future, and engaging in the activities which also do the same. And doing that over and over again has, I think, improved my quality of life substantially. And so that's the thing that I try and have been sharing with people more recently.
Yeah, and clearly you're doing a great job with the podcast and everything. Of
Thank you, man.
yeah, we can transition a little bit to the podcast because I really look up to you as a podcaster. You know, I think every time you bring in such like a big guest, I'm like, whoa, this is so cool. Like I learned so much from listening to your episodes. I think you ask like fantastic questions because you're just curious to know about, the guests and what their story and their journey is about.
Mm.
So how do you go like what's your process of going about reaching out to these like big guests? Like do you have like a system like of like cold DMing people? Do you like go off like from like connections from other friends? Like how do you kind of approach podcasting in general?
Yeah. Um, the thing about even being online and interacting with people is that you realize how small the world is. Like you can just reach out and DM people, and their willingness to engage in a conversation, I've found like a surprisingly high hit rate with even cold DMs.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it varies on the individual that I'm trying to bring on. So there are friends of friends who I'd love to bring onto the podcast,
Mhm.
and when it's that angle, then I'll certainly try and use a warm introduction of somebody that I respect and they respect me, because I think that goes a long way in terms of those people being willing to jump on the podcast. But I've only done kind of warm intros for the podcast probably like 4 or 5 times, maybe a little bit more than that.
Mhm.
But oftentimes the default is I'll email them or I'll DM them, and I will try and be as articulate as possible as to why I want to bring them on the podcast. And I try and make that outreach very like sincere, and to communicate like, hey, I'm not just some podcaster that just like wants to have you on my podcast. So you're like, a badge in my Rolodex of people of like, hey, I had this person on the podcast. I want to communicate like, hey, I actually have a deep interest in the work that you're doing, in the ideas that you're thinking about. And I think that that often comes through when I do, reach out to those people.
Mhm.
Sometimes you'll get no responses, or sometimes you'll get a, hey, this isn't the right time. But if you follow up in 3 6 months, and you make an effort to say like, hey, this is something that actually matters to me and I'd love to have a conversation with you, then people are surprisingly willing to engage. What have you found with your own podcast? I'm curious when you reach out to
Mm.
people, because you're in a different stage of life than I am,
Yeah.
and you're considerably younger than I am. Have you found it to be similar, or have you found it to be tricky to get guests on to the podcast that you'd hope to have on?
Yeah, I think it was a podcast between David Perell and Paul Millard who was saying that people are disproportionately willing to help young people out on their journeys when they're starting out. So
Mm,
I think one I guess advantage you could say is kind of like my age. I could use like I'm a young person who's just eager to learn about like your work. I really admire your work, and
yeah.
most often than not, a lot of people would say yes to that, and I think that's been a really cool thing of like as long as you approach yourself as a curious person who's willing to learn and like and offer a new perspective, whether through asking good questions or not, I think that's most often
Mm.
it's a successful podcast episode.
I think so. And I think
Yeah,
that a lot of people that have found success and that know how difficult it is, and just the grind of doing a podcast, because
yeah,
it's a lot of work, right? Especially if you're doing any editing in the background and then you have to publish to multiple platforms. Managing all that stuff is like, it takes a ton of time.
mm,
And podcasting is probably the worst medium to scale, because there really is no like easy virality mechanism
yeah,
unless you go into short form video, and that even takes more time, and there's tons of people trying to pump their podcast via short form video.
yeah,
So it's just it's such a difficult thing to do. But the one thing that I'll say is, if you are not just saying, hey, I'm a curious person, hey, I'm really smart and intelligent and thoughtful, but you can point those people that you're reaching out to a personal website that tracks and documents all of the impressive stuff that you have done over years, then it gives them much more reason to actually engage in a conversation with you. And for you, it's like you're very young, so there's only so much track record you have. But if you're starting now at 16, 17, 18 years old and can do this for decades, that's a huge asset. And when I had Ben Wilson on the podcast from How to Take Over the World,
Oh
um,
yeah, yeah.
I had cold outreach to him. This was when I had probably like 200 followers on Twitter and was like a nobody. But I had sent him my personal website, and he had looked through it and saw what I was reading, what I was listening to. He saw the gym streak, all of that stuff, and he was like, I saw the stuff that you were doing on your personal website, and it looked like you're going places. And so that's part of the benefit of having your own online record of progress, is that you can show that to people of how serious you are, about these activities that you're engaging in. And so that certainly has gone a long way in terms of the outreach as well.
Yeah, that's a great story. And he had to kind of get used to the rejections as well, like you said so many cool DMs, like not everyone's gonna come back with a yes, So I think learning how to handle rejection is such a
Mm.
another valuable asset when it comes to podcasting. And I'm
And
sure
if you
that
can learn that at your age, like that is so unique, because
yeah.
especially as somebody who um, has tendencies to be a perfectionist, dealing with rejection and failure is a very difficult thing. And I think that I've gotten a lot better at just like taking the blows on the chin and continue to move forward, and not to take it personally, because there was always an instinct to take it personally when somebody says, no, I'm not interested, no, I don't have time, and to be like, man, that guy sucks, or like you have some sort of like
Yeah, yeah.
frustration or anger towards them because of their rejection. But now I've become much more comfortable in understanding of taking rejection and failure. And if only I had that, 3 or 4 years ago, I think it would have served me, so much better. But it's hard to deal with that, and it's cool for me to find people like you and other people that are young that have already, dealt with that very well early on.
I'm trying my best, man. Yeah. I'm also curious, like, what differences do you notice between being a host versus being
Mm.
a guest right now? Like, is any differences with that?
Well, it's a lot easier for me to be a guest than it is to be a
Oh.
host. Because, well, and it depends on the nature of the discussion. So,
Mhm.
like, some of the conversations that I've had on the podcast are with people that I have had professional relationships with beforehand, or they were personal friends. And so those podcasts, like, I still do some prep work, but there isn't the stress and the anxiety of jumping into a first time conversation that I think, holds a lot of the pressure around being a host.
Yeah.
And when, like, if you're a guest, as long as you're comfortable having a conversation, I think you can just jump into them and you don't have to second guess yourself. So for me, it's a lot more of an enjoyable experience, I'd say, to be
Uh-huh.
a guest. But at the same time, I think the value that I've seen in hosting a podcast and having a little bit of pressure is that there is something healthy about having that stress in your life of, like,
Yeah.
in high school, I was a gymnast, and there were always competitions and there were meets, and there was a specific set time where you would have an opportunity to demonstrate your skill, and you'd come out of that either succeeding or not succeeding, right? And that came with a lot of stress, anxiety, and all of that stuff. But I think that's really important to one's personal development. And the fact that as people get into their 20s or 30s and even after that, they don't have a regular kind of like performance event that they are regularly engaging in. And for me, like, podcasting is kind of like that. Like, yes, I still get a little bit anxious or worried,
Yeah.
or I want to like over engineer to make sure it's just like the right conversation. But and I don't like the stress per se, but I appreciate it for what it is, and I do think it's adding to my own like personal development.
Mm.
And so I do find a lot of value in the whole preparation process as well.
Yeah, I think what kind of goes undersaid is like, the little twinge of stress that comes with, as a host, that you have to kind of carry the conversation moving forward, and you have to kind
Yeah.
of plan everything else before. So yeah, and like even right now, like, I have like two tabs open with questions and the Zoom meeting. So, you kind of have to like it's a balancing act when you're a host trying to, manage
Yes.
the conversation well. So I think that's
Well, and
yeah.
the one thing about podcasting is that I do think it gets a lot more fun and enjoyable as you get older as well, because like one, the more conversations that you've had, the more comfortable you are just
Yeah.
engaging in conversation, and you don't have to stress as much about steering the conversation in one direction or the other. And two is like sometimes you just don't know what to say. Like you want to say something thoughtful, you want to say something funny, you want to add on to the remark in an intelligent way where like the audience would appreciate it, and you just haven't had the amount of accumulated knowledge stored up in your brain through reading books, through listening to podcasts, to all of that stuff, to where you have anything to add, But if this is a lifelong project for you, then those things will come up naturally. Like 5 years ago, I would have been like very embarrassed to have had a podcast, and I would have felt very uncomfortable. But the fact that over the last 3 or 4 years, just the amount of consumption in terms of information that I've been digesting since then, there's so much more that I can add to the conversation that makes it fun and interesting and all of that stuff. And so the fact that you're able to still like manage and steer and have a fun, engaging conversation with somebody for as young as you are, I think there's a lot of exciting things for the future of this podcast for sure.
Yeah, dude, that's such another amazing observation. It's like when you over time when you accumulate so much knowledge and you begin having conversations with people, it's like now you can like tap into different domains of knowledge and be
Mm.
able to have like a really fruitful conversation because you know like how different like topics and sectors connect with each other. So I think it's another really good observation.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
even if you
yeah.
were to map out on a linear time scale, and I've done this a couple of times where it's like, okay, let's say I'm 25 years old, and I've been reading on average since I was 20 years old, like 50 books, per year.
Mhm.
That means I've read 250 books, and that might sound like, oh, that's a lot of books, but if you extrapolate those same numerics for somebody that is in their 60s or somebody that is in their 70s, just
Mhm.
the amount of knowledge, and this is ignoring potentially the compounding effects that knowledge has, right? If you just
Mhm.
take it on a linear basis, if you think about the people that are in their 60s and their 70s that are actually learners and take their learning seriously, the amount
Mhm.
of respect that you should have for those people and the amount of time that they put in is is not negligible. And so sometimes I come into the conversations with somebody that's in their 40s or in their 50s, and I'm just very humbled because it's so obvious that they know so much, and it's so obvious that I know so little, so much to an extent of like I don't even know what kind of a question I should ask them that would be thoughtful and move the conversation forward. But I think that's all part of the podcast learning journey and having an appreciation for lifelong learning in general.
Yeah, man. I have one more question related to podcasting that can be fun. But like, how do you know what questions to ask? I know like the quality of questions that a host asks is like really important to having
Hmm.
a really good conversation. So like, how do you approach like asking good questions?
So I might have maybe an alternative perspective when it comes to this as
Mhm.
compared to other people. But oftentimes people will think that the questions that are asked are very important, and no doubt I think that that is true. But I
Mhm.
think what's maybe even more true is the delivery of the questions themselves, and that is something that's very hard to teach. Right? Is like I can tell it's one thing if you ask a question in a monotone voice and you just don't seem that interested, but you thought it was a thoughtful question to ask. And so you spit it out and you throw it out there. Like, that's very easy for me to detect when I'm having a conversation with somebody of like, yeah, that was just on their list of questions and they're just going one by one down the question list. And, that's so obvious. I think what's more powerful is to even take a boring question and to try and show as much genuine interest and curiosity and energy within the question that's being asked as possible. Because I think that comes through the microphone. I think that comes through the facial expressions, all of that stuff. Right. And so when I have interviews with most people, like maybe the question not to ask because it's so routinely asked is like, tell me your story kind of a thing. Right. But
Yeah.
it's one thing to just sit there on a podcast and interview somebody for the first time and say, hey, can you tell me your story? Versus like framing it in a way of like, hey, I know you did X, Y, and Z. I'm really curious about how Y connects to Z because those two things don't really make sense in my mind as having connected.
Mhm.
And I know you did these things before you did X, Y, and Z that kind of informed some of those decisions. Can you tell me about that journey? Right? Those are in some sense asking the same question of tell me about your story, but doing it in a way that is much more thoughtful and communicates to the person that you're having the conversation with that you have like thought through some of those questions. That goes a long way. So I think my whole thing has been, try and be as sincere and earnest as possible, because that comes through and makes a difference in the conversation. And I think that'll go a long way. Even if you ask like stupid questions, but you do it in a way that you're like genuinely authentic and curious, then I think it will be well received by the audience member and the interviewee, and that'll go a long way.
Yeah. So it seems like the framing is just as important as the substance of the question. So
Mm-hmm.
wow.
Yeah. I mean, and
Uh-huh.
there's I can't remember who the quote is by, but it's like people don't remember what you said, but how you made them feel. And
Mm,
I oftentimes think that is very true with asking questions as well. Is it doesn't matter what you ask, but maybe like how that person felt when you asked the question. Is did that person sincerely actually want to know the answer to that question? Did they actually care about the content of that question? Or are they just a robot, spitting through questions and doing this podcast is, and not taking it seriously? I think those things are quite different.
yeah, that's great, man. Okay, so something I'm also really, really curious about is like on your website, you have a whole listening library and your whole like book tracking and everything. Like you
Hmm.
can like I think the amount of like information knowledge that you consume is such at a high bar. So I'm really curious, like how do you remember everything you've consumed? Because I imagine like I know I've talked to other people, some people implement like Anki systems, spaced repetition, whatever, right? And
Hmm.
like how do you kind of have a system where you remember what you like consume, and how do you make sure like that actually like you're able to implement that into your own life?
So the short answer is I don't, and I worry a lot about the fact
Mm,
that even when I read a book, right? If we were to both read a book and it's the same book, and
yeah.
at the end of the month you were to come and say, all right, Tyler, on this essay or in this essay, like write an essay on the book and tell me like what you learned in as much detail as possible. You know, I wouldn't be so confident in my ability to do a good job summarizing a book,
Mm,
and maybe that speaks to the fact that I'm not retaining or learning a lot. But I think that so much of the learning happens on a subconscious level, and that sometimes those things can't be articulated until you have the right experiences in life to kind of pair them to.
true.
um, so, I mean, part of the reason why I have an audio library is because I forget all the times the podcast that I listened to and the podcast that had an impact on me. And so when I go 6 months ago, a year ago, and I look through all of the episodes that I was listening to, I can be like, oh, yeah, I do actually remember this podcast. And I remember it having a meaningful impact on my life and it leading to me to take action X, Y, and Z. And so
Mm,
a big part of the reason why I started the whole audio library is because I wasn't retaining a lot and I wanted to start to document what it was that I was consuming.
mm,
I do ultimately think that there is a lot of value in terms of being a competitive learner, of trying to articulate things in as much detail as possible. One of the things that has probably changed my life the most in the last 4 or 5 months was I've been using Readwise and connecting it to my Kindle. And
oh.
in the morning every day, I will go through 15 highlights of 50 plus books that I have read over the last couple of years.
Mhm,
And the fact that I can just regularly be flashing those things in front of my face and use that as a system to retain knowledge has been incredibly powerful. I've been thinking a lot about this types of stuff that I am consuming and how information dense they are. And so if you think about books in general, one of the reasons why
yeah.
books are a lot more information dense than, a podcast is in a podcast, people are just spitting words back and forth to each other, but there's some thought that goes into it, but it's not like somebody is sitting down for hours on end and saying, all right, this is the thing that I'm going to say, right? It's a lot more spontaneous and serendipitous and all of that. But with a
Right.
book, it's like people are spending sometimes years and years and years to determine which words hit that page, right? And then I read that book. And so that book is very information dense. And then I go through that book and I highlight the stuff that hit me in a very unique way. And now I have an even, more refined information dense piece of information that then hits my Readwise account. And cycling those things through my brain over and over again has just been super powerful. And so the thing that I've been thinking about recently is, what is the corollary to Readwise on a podcasting platform? Because and there are some tools now where you can clip and save podcasts, but to me it just feels so clunky. But I would love to, in the middle of a podcast, as I'm listening to it, just say to myself, okay, capture the last 30 seconds of what that person just said and just put it into a library. And then, whether it's I'm going on a walk every week or every month or whatever, I would just play that playlist of those clips that I had done. I think that would be a pretty powerful thing to do in terms of improving my retention. So the long and short of it is, I'm trying to make incremental steps to improve my retention over time. But at the same time, I don't go crazy over it. And part of that is because I think that so much of the learning happens in the background of what I'm not consciously aware of. But as long as I'm pursuing things that I'm genuinely curious about and that I feel like there is some information value in, then I can rest easy that I'm headed in the right direction.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of, the new perspective changes are because of the subconscious kind of drilling into our minds that we kind of look at every few days. So, and I think that's where the real benefit of, reading books is, because sometimes we don't really immediately know how that book changed our life until we, as you said, like we encounter some situation where that thing is practical in that regard. So that's a really good point you touched on there.
I don't know if you've ever did you have lockers when you were in high school?
Oh,
like
man.
Physical lockers?
I think middle school I had, but I didn't use any lockers in high school though.
Okay. Well, the reason I ask is because this metaphor kind of comes up for me where, with a locker, you have your combination, right?
Yeah.
And what I had realized is that sometimes if I wasn't in the context of being in front of my locker and needing to open my locker, I wouldn't be able to remember the combination. Like if I was, just having a conversation with a friend and I wasn't in school, let's say I was, at a soccer tournament or something like that. And somebody had asked me like, hey, tell me your, the combination to your locker in school. Like sometimes I would forget what the combination of my locker was. But if I went through the whole motion and I had the context of being in front of the locker and needing to get something out of my locker, I was able to tap into, what the combination was. And so, what that taught me is that context matters a lot, is like in certain contexts, your brain will kind of adapt to certain situations. And I find that the same thing is true of books as well, where I'll read a book and I'll think like, oh, okay, that was good. I understood most of what I learned there, right? But it isn't until 2, 3, 4 years later where there's some specific context that I am encountering or some sort of experience that I am encountering where it opens my eyes to, oh, now I understood what that person meant when they were writing this book and that I had read 3 or 4 years ago. And so, pairing context and experience together is something that is so important, I think, to just learning in general. And that is one of the reasons why I don't stress too much about over articulating the knowledge that I understand, because I feel like so much of it is hard to articulate. And so much of the learning that I've done, I need experiences to pair the learning with in order for me to actually like communicate it on a verbal level. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about lately, because there is a tendency to be like, man, I listen to all these podcasts and I can't even like summarize what it was I had learned in these podcasts. Like one example is John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Like I've been going through his 50 lecture series over the course of probably the last couple of years, and just popping those in the background as I'm like, doing household chores. And it's funny because if somebody asked me like, tell me some deep insights that you've learned from listening to that series, I would really struggle to articulate what it is I'm absorbing. But there is something there that I know, even if it's only 5%, 10%, 15% of the signal that's being communicated, that something is coming through and that I'm appreciating that. And so I kind of just rest easy and am like, I'm going to continue to do that, even if I don't have a great articulation as to what it is exactly that, I'm absorbing here.
Yeah. Context matters a lot. And to give an example, it's like when I like learn a piece on piano, for example, right? like I can remember everything if I'm like facing the piano and actually playing it. But if I'm
Mm.
like out like not at the piano, it's like where do I put my fingers, you know? So so it's the power of association is like really important in like many domains of life, not just for reading, but cross
Yeah,
other
and
yeah,
also the
yeah,
knowledge that can be explained is very different from the knowledge that one possesses. Because one
yeah.
example is, so I do like handstand push-ups as a part of my workout
Mhm,
routine, right? And I have people come up to me and they'll be like, "Hey, I'm struggling to do a handstand. Can you please explain to me like how it is that you do a handstand?"
mhm,
And I just find it very, very difficult for me to explain to other people how it is I'm able to do the handstand, because that knowledge is something that is very experiential that I've just accumulated over time. And it's so deep in my subconscious at this point that I can't even articulate to a beginner, all the nuances and details as to how they should get up into the handstand position. I'm just like, it just happens. And so that's another reason why I try and be careful about worrying that I don't have knowledge if I can't explain it, because sometimes it's just it's muscle memory. It's something underneath that is just very difficult to explain in simple terms.
yeah. And now pivoting to the big thing, which is you moving to South Korea in a few days.
Yeah.
Like, what are the like the emotions, the feelings that are running through your head right now? Because I imagine like you must be really anticipating for this really big, profound change in your life. So I'm curious to hear your process, your thought process behind all of it.
Yeah, I'm very excited, is the first thing. Is My last day of work was about 2 weeks ago now.
Wow.
And I was worried about that period of like not having work and wondering if there was going to be too much anxiety and stress for me to deal with.
Mhm,
But it has been very nice, just in terms of shutting off all the background noise of work life that has, the emails, the Teams pings, all of that stuff.
mhm,
It sucks up a lot of your bandwidth. And just to have some peace of mind of, I'm going to go read a book, I'm going to listen to a podcast, I'm going to work on my own projects, I'm going to go and write for a little bit, to have that open space is just very freeing. Now, at the same time, it's like I am going into this experience with a couple of objectives. And one is I would like to, at the end of, let's say, 18 months to 24 months, be like financially self-sustaining in a way where I can continue to be like very independent as well. And
mhm,
by independent, I mean like have flexibility with my time and my schedule, and just to be kind of more in control of my day to day.
mhm.
And I don't know if that's going to be possible, and that's scary. Is not knowing if things are going to work out is scary, but it's also, I think, a big part of maturity. So there's that dimension to it, and then there's I am curious in general about the world, and I am curious about South Korea. And if you look at any country, right, in relation to their size geographically and by population, in terms of what has had immense global impact, like Korea definitely stands out as being one of those. And so I'm excited to make this very a learning, enriching experience all around. And so for me to be able to study Korean history and Korean culture, and to hopefully through the podcast, interview interesting people in Korea
Ooh,
about their life experience as well. Like there's so many projects and just not enough time for me to engage in. So overall, I'm very excited. I'm nervous at the same time, but I think it will be very beneficial to my development.
yeah. Imagine with like all like the more like I guess freedom of time that you'll have during your time in South Korea. Imagine like it'll be like a really big time for reflection and
Mm.
just rethinking about like, okay, what do I actually want in life and like what are my priorities? What do I actually want to work on? And imagine like all the big questions are gonna come flooding in your head.
They already have, man. They already have.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, to have a
Yeah.
whole year to be thinking about those things, potentially more. Um,
Mhm.
who knows the ideas and the novelty and the serendipity. It's cool to give yourself a little bit of an open space to meet more people, learn from their journeys, and explore what's possible. Because I think that's the thing that is unfortunate about most people that enter their 20s and 30s, and they have a very defined path for their life, is that they don't have as much time to explore and experiment and to figure out what could be possible if they were willing to take some risks. And so, I feel like there's pressure of, hey, I got to make something out of this, something big out of it. And that pressure is a burden, and it's nobody's burden except for my own, and nobody is putting the pressure on me aside from myself. But I think that I try and look at pressure as a privilege every single day, and I think this will be a big privilege in terms of an experience overall.
Yeah. How did like your family and friends like view your decision to, move to South Korea?
So
Yeah.
I had
Uh-huh.
done 2 summers in Japan when I was an undergrad student, and
Oh,
those
nice.
were some of the most formative experiences, and that kind of influenced why I was excited to go back to Asia, but
Yeah.
this time to be in Korea. And so even before embarking on this whole adventure, I had kind of hinted like 2 years ago that like, hey, this is something that I would like to do. Now, at that time, I
Mhm.
think my family and the people around me were just like, yeah, that sounds like it would be a cool thing to do. But it's like,
Uh-huh.
people say those things all the time. But as the date got closer and as I started to like aggressively accumulate savings to make this possible,
Mhm.
there were questions of like, hey, you're on a really good path now, right? Career wise, and from a financial perspective, are you sure you want to do this? Because
Mhm.
the financial opportunity cost is very material of me not working for a whole year, potentially longer, to do something like this. And I think it's beneficial for me, the fact that like a lot of my family members and a lot of my friends, they follow along with some of the stuff that I'm putting out,
Yeah.
and so they can kind of understand a little bit the perspective that I'm coming from. Whereas if they had no context as to the stuff that I was working on and the stuff that really I was excited about, then it probably would have been much more difficult for them to comprehend. But overall, they've been very supportive, and that's been a huge piece in the puzzle in terms of giving me relief and comfort of
Mhm.
taking this leave, is that they have been overwhelmingly supportive, and they're very excited for me. So I couldn't be more excited with how things turned out.
Yeah, I'm super excited for you as well. Like I can't wait to see, like the transformation that you're just gonna go through with this really cool experience.
Thanks, man. And the cool thing is,
Yeah.
especially these days with technology, is I don't know if I would do this trip if I wasn't able to bring other people along with me, right? So it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, I'll be in South Korea, but it's like, if you and I 6 months from now are like, hey, we should catch up sometime, we can still connect. And
Yeah.
even whether it's through your newsletter or my newsletter or through the podcast or whatever, we can still, be in regular communication. And that's pretty amazing. If it was 50 years ago and I was moving to Korea
Oh
and it was like I had to
yeah.
basically cut ties with everybody in my life, then I don't I don't think I would make that jump. But to be able to um, enjoy and experience a new country and also kind of bring people along that have been part of my journey, in all walks of life in all parts of the world, that's something that I'm very excited about for sure.
Yeah. Pivoting to a few more topics here. I think I was looking through your listening log, and I think you recommended me actually the Symbolic World podcast with Jonathan Pagot, and I'm really curious to hear like where you stand in your faith, because I think that's something I'm wrestling with, and I know you're kind of dabbling into that area as well. So I'm curious to hear like your take on it.
So this is a tricky question for me. But I'll say this. When I went to Stanford, for example, there
Yeah.
was a period of time where like I had very deep questions about my own faith, and it was even hard for me to assess what is it exactly that I believe, and that worried me a lot. But what I had kind of learned throughout that experience is that like ultimately I'm a pragmatist in some extent to some extent. Like if I am adopting a belief and a worldview that is enhancing my life, that is giving me more energy, that is giving me more hope, and that seems to check out in terms of translating to some like material consequences as well, then I should continue to lean in that direction, even if I don't have a full understanding of everything that's going on inside my brain, you know? And
Mhm.
so there was a period when I was at Stanford where I had some deep doubts about this stuff. And what I had realized is that when I had like, let's say, taken a break from the church, right?
Yeah.
Or that the spiritual, religious kind of Christianity side of my life was I was not as engaged and I didn't take as seriously. Like there were consequences for that, right? Like things were not going well.
Mhm.
And I realized to some extent, like, because I grew up with it, the church and the Christian faith and all of that stuff, it was such a deep part of my identity that I almost like don't have control over the moral frame that I adopt, right?
Mhm.
And so I would say like I identify as a Christian, today, and there seems to be something real about like all of what Jonathan Pajot is putting out there, and even some of the stuff that like Jordan Peterson touches on,
Yeah, yeah.
and other thinkers in that domain, that it just seems right to me. And it's kind of like the John Vervaeke awakening from the meaning crisis of like I'm absorbing
Mhm.
all of this knowledge and information, and there seems to be something there, but I don't have the toolkit or the experiences to articulate exactly what it is I'm understanding. I think that same dynamic is happening
Mhm.
because and I don't know how valuable or interesting you found like some of the stuff that Jonathan Pajot in the Symbolic World has been, sharing in his podcast.
Yeah, yeah.
But to me, it's like those are some of the deepest intellectual like insights that I have had over the past, couple of months.
Mhm.
And for me to just, kind of turn my face and be like, yeah, Christianity and all that stuff, I'm skeptical of it. Like the stuff that he's saying is making sense on a level that hasn't made sense when I hear other people talk about these things.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, I am a Christian and I don't have a full understanding as to like all these questions that I want answered. But I think this is the right path for me to be on. And for me, it's like there's some level of faith, as
Mhm.
like I don't have all the answers. And I don't know if all the other people in my life have the answers up to my level of satisfaction. But there's so much high signal information and insight that I'm getting from that whole ecosystem that has enriched my own like belief and has added to, when I was talking about hope before, has added and fueled the fire of like hope within me. And so I think that's something that I can't just, turn away from, even if I don't have a full, like materialistic understanding of all
Yeah,
this.
yeah. Yeah, I think I watched one of his videos. It's like the idea of like unity and multiplicity is like, what is this? It just like blew my mind. Like even now, I don't really have a full grasp of the understanding, but like
Yeah.
I think it was like a paradigm shifter, and I feel like it's this subconscious thing that's just warping like my whole belief around like what the world is actually like, and
Mm,
I think it's kind of to go with things that just kind of like change your mind in like ways you wouldn't expect.
yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And it's happening to me on a regular basis, to where, I feel like if all this stuff was wrong, if it didn't check out for me in my own brain, like it is very much a personal experience. There's a huge personal experience dimension to faith,
Mhm.
you know, and and for me, like if stuff just stopped making sense, even with the smart people talking about faith and all that stuff, then I would just slowly. It's almost like you can't help, like if somebody wrongs you multiple times in a row, right? And then they come to you and say, "Do you trust me or do you not trust me?" And then I tell them like, "Hey, I don't trust you. You've just screwed up multiple times in a row. Like I don't trust you." Right? It's
Yeah,
like it's not up to me as to whether or not I have the ability to trust you or not. It's like the actions that you have demonstrated over and over and over again, I can't control but not trust you, because that's just, that's just my personal experience of interacting with you time and time again. And so when I listen to various podcasts that touch on religious topics, it's like time and time again, I'm getting insight. I'm getting what seems closer to truth and understanding, to where I can't just say, I don't understand any of that stuff. I don't believe in any of that stuff. It's all like, hogwash. It's like my own like heart and my mind, it's like drawn to that. And it continues to
yeah,
be drawn to that because it seems to be uncovering something that's very real. And so I think maybe I'm in the same boat as you in terms of not having a full understanding. But there seems to be, something real there that other domains and academic studies in life, they don't provide the same sort of insight.
yeah. It's like this, the uncovering of truth. You peel back each layer until maybe one day we'll reach, the very core of everything. Yeah,
Well said, my friend. Well said.
yeah,
I hope so. I hope that's what the
yeah,
journey that we're both on.
yeah. Let's finish off with some I guess fun and quirky questions.
All right, let's do it.
One of them I thought of is like, if you had a time machine, where and when would you go to and why?
Oh man.
Yeah.
Time machine, where and when would I go to and why? Uh I don't even know if I have great answers for these ones off the cuff because
No
I
worries,
feel
bro.
like my understanding of history is just so limited that it would be
Uh,
hard for me to even pick a specific time and place. I'll have to punt on that one, and then the next time you have me on the podcast, which
uh,
hopefully we'll do a round two, I'll have a better answer for. How about that?
all right. Yeah. I guess the next question is like, what do you believe is like the modern day of cigarettes or smoking?
Hmm. I mean, I think the popular answer is to say something like social media, but I don't necessarily think that that corollary is as right. Mostly because I don't see any of the upside of something like cigarettes, right? Like the health consequences are just they're quite cruel if you do that on a regular,
Mhm.
repeated basis. Whereas with social media, it's like a double-edged sword where yes, for a large part of society, it could be deadly and a distraction, and it could cause huge mental drainage just in terms of one's intellect. But on the flip side, if you are using it in a responsible way, if you're meeting new people, if you're having podcast conversations with interesting people, the amount of value that it could bring to your life is very substantial. So not a great answer, but I'll just take maybe a counter argument in terms of what the most popular answer would be, which is I think probably some form of social media.
Amazing. All right. Okay, let's finish off with the very last question I always ask for every single podcast episode, which is, if you had one singular piece of advice for your 18-year-old self, what would it be?
Hmm. One singular piece of advice for my 18-year-old self. I'm so skeptical of giving advice because
Mm,
I think that you have to pair experiences with the advice. Otherwise, the advice just does not make sense. And so, maybe I will regret this depending on the way in which my life turns out. But I tend to think that, you know, my life and the circumstances around them and the experiences that I had and all of that stuff was set up in a way that God had ordained and knew was best. And so I don't think I would give myself any advice. And any of the advice that I would give myself now, I wouldn't have taken seriously. I just don't think it wouldn't have resonated with me in the same way. So maybe the only thing I wish is that I wish I would have seen the insight of how important it is to play long-term games earlier. And specifically in terms of long-term games, investing in relationships that have compounding potential, investing my time, energy, and resources into assets that have close to an infinite time horizon, right? One of the reasons podcasting is so beautiful is because you produce a podcast episode and you have that conversation for the rest of your life, and it can spread at zero marginal cost, and you can benefit from it, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, etc. And I wish I had a deeper understanding of that when I was 18 years old. And so maybe I would just try and nudge my past self in that direction if I could.
amazing. Dude, I learned so much from our conversations today. And man, best of luck with, the next few days, traveling to South Korea and adjusting to this new life. Like, I'm very stoked for you.
Thank you, my friend. And I'm excited for all that's going to come for you in the next 12 months. Even just having conversations with you, like you have a very unique optimism about life. And I find that very rare, and that to be a huge asset for young people. So I'm excited to follow along with your journey as well. And thank you for having me on the pod.